All right. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome on this lovely Saturday afternoon here in late July. I want to thank everybody who is able to join us live, and for probably the majority of people who will be listening to us afterwards. I want to um, just introduce our very special guest that we have today. Super excited to have Dr. Tom Wadsworth on our channel today. He is an eminent biblical scholar who's been doing some research in a very critical area of New Testament and early church ecclesiology. And Dr. Wadsworth, would you like to go ahead and just give a brief intro for yourself, as well as your work and some of the works that you're doing right now?
Yes. Well, first off, I'm really glad to be with you, Dr. Davis. It's always good to talk to a medical doctor. I've always found in our previous discussions before this broadcast, you have an analytical mind. You approach things kind of like a doctor would. You need to rely on absolutely solid information before you proceed with any kind of conclusions, and that's what I'm doing here. So. My focus is on, as you mentioned, first century Christian assemblies. This was what my doctoral dissertation was about. And the shocking result of my 50 years of research into this topic is that even though we today might have worship services, and we talk about going to worship and having houses of worship and hours of worship and opening worship with this and closing worship with that, having acts of worship and an order of worship and a worship pastor, and all that kind of language is, in fact, foreign to the New Testament. And when I started to broadcast some of this stuff on YouTube just a couple of years ago, it started to really take off. I think we've got more than 1.3 million views now, more than 20,000 subscribers from 110 countries around the world. It's amazing how many people are picking up on this. Yes, there's some people who are saying, absolutely, Wadsworth, you are a heretic. You need to be killed as soon as possible. Because it does sound heretical that somehow the early church didn't have worship services. What is wrong with you? Well, it's not what's wrong with me, but it begs a lot of questions about how we got where we are with our assembly activity today and why we call it what we do. And is it consistent with what's in the New Testament? And what's the big deal? Is it a bad thing that we call it worship services? And how is it different from the first century? So my doctoral dissertation did a very deep dive into these questions, especially into a study of the Greek words that are translated as worship in the New Testament. And that study itself is quite illuminating and enlightening. So that's the sum of what my research is. I could say one more thing. If the purpose of the first century assemblies was not to worship God, and it wasn't, what then was it? Well, here again, the New Testament is just crystal clear on this. There are three words that are used repeatedly to refer to the nature and purpose of Christian gatherings, and I summarize those with three words: SEE. Strengthening, encouragement, and edification. And they're all kind of the same idea of just building up the body of Christ. That was the purpose, actually the commanded purpose of everything you do. It comes primarily from 1 Corinthians 14, verse 26, where this is the longest chapter in the Bible that deals with the Christian assembly. And Paul uses this word for building up, oikodome, 7 times in this chapter, and he comes to this conclusion in verse 26 when he says, "What then, brethren, when you come together?" And he lists off several things that you might be doing, but then he says, "Let all things be done for oikodome, for edification, for the building up of the body of Christ." So to summarize my thesis here, is that the first century assemblies did not, in fact, consider their gatherings to be worship services. Rather, they considered them to be these edifying gatherings where they built up one another. That's a quick summary, I think.
Yeah, I like that summary. And certainly 1 Corinthians chapter 14 was a passage that, as I read much of your dissertation, and I also had an opportunity to teach on this passage within my own local church context, it was something that I noticed that was quite striking. Before we kind of talk about the SEE portion and sort of the positive aspect, I would like to maybe focus a little bit upon, maybe the historical use of this term worship within, I guess, Christian context, and how we sort of self-identified or sort of self-defined our own, sort of Christian gatherings. And you mentioned this idea of the anomaly or the worship anomaly. I think you've referred to it elsewhere as like the terminological problem with our term worship. Can you talk a little bit about, what made those New Testament assemblies distinct from our practice that has sort of developed in church history, and what is a little bit of the background that you see in terms of how this sort of wrong terminology arose in the early church?
Yeah, great question. Some people have said to me, people in the first century didn't call it worship services because they all knew it was a worship service. Well, okay, let's say that's a possible theory. So then what I did, in addition to looking at just the New Testament, let's look into second century Christian literature. Let's look into third century Christian literature. Let's look into 4th century Christian literature. And by the way, this is a massive volume of Christian writings that comes out of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Way more information than what we have in our little New Testaments. And sure enough, even in the 2nd, even in the 3rd century, they're still not calling their gatherings worship services. This idea begins to, the seeds of it start to get planted in there, but then it comes into fruition in around the 4th century, where they start to view their assemblies as worship and as services. And here's the progression of idea there. Around the end of the 1st century, the seeds start to get planted. The 1st century church is starting to look at the Lord's Supper as our sacrifice that we are giving to God. And that sounds strange to a lot of Protestants today, but it's quite common even in the Catholic and in the Orthodox world. They would still view the Lord's Supper, the Holy Eucharist, as our sacrifice. Well, once that idea began to take root, then pretty soon, later into the 2nd century, the table upon which the Lord's Supper sat was viewed as an altar. Because, after all, if we're offering a sacrifice to God, you've got to have an altar. This is Old Testament thinking. This is also pagan thinking. Even in the pagan temples of that day, you have Ephesus behind you in the background there, Richard. And there, I've been to Ephesus a couple of times. There are ancient temples there, not Jewish ones, of course, but pagan ones. They all had altars of sacrifice. And then, as you proceed into the 3rd century, the person who presided over the altar that held the sacrifice in Christian gatherings was viewed as a priest. Whoa, now this is different now. You don't see this in the 1st century. All Christians are priests then, and you don't see it in the 2nd century. But now, the 3rd century, whoa, it's really starting to come on strong. And so then, by the time you get to the 4th century, and Constantine declares Christianity a legal religion, and Christians start to build not just little buildings, but some magnificent cathedrals funded by Constantine personally and by the Roman Empire corporately. They're wanting to have really impressive buildings in the 4th century. And Constantine funded and his government funded, I think, at least 40 churches that we know of, church buildings that we know of. And so there you have fully restored the Old Testament Jewish idea of having a temple, a holy place, in which you had priests who presided over an altar that offered sacrifices. You have basically resurrected Judaism, you've also mirrored the pagan world, which is doing the same thing. But Christians in the first century never would have looked at it that way. The Lord's Supper is not a sacrifice. The person who presides there is no person who presides in the first century New Testament. You don't have altars, you don't have temples, you don't have holy places at all. But by the fourth century, you have all that. And these four things, sacrifice, altar, priest, and temple, this constitutes the Greek idea of latreia. The verb form is latruo, which is to offer sacrifices. The practice of offering a sacrifice to a deity is called latreia. And that word is also in our New Testament, but it doesn't refer to assemblies of offering sacrifices to God. Jesus did that once for all. We don't need to do that anymore. All done. But once you have this ceremonial approach to the Christian gathering, with all these special religious things like altars and sacrifices and priests and even holy furniture and a holy place in which all this takes place, then you've got your sacramental, ceremonial approach to the gathering, which it did not have in the first century. So that's how we got it. We haven't cleansed that from our system since the fourth century. Even the Protestant reformers in the 16th century are still perpetuating much of that. They're starting to see there's something wrong in general with a lot of other things, but they never attacked this particular concept, which I think really needs a good, close look at.
Yeah, that's a great overview, Dr. Wadsworth. Just a couple of quick follow-ups on that. And I certainly just want to say that when I read your work for the first time, when you mentioned that term oikodome or oikodomeo in its various forms and conjugations that we see in the Greek New Testament, very similar to other doctrines, maybe you see these sort of proto-Trinitarian formulae within the New Testament. It's one of those things that once you see it, you can't unsee it, that it's something that pops up everywhere. Just a couple of quick passages for the audience that I believe we discussed last time. When you look at, say, a passage like Acts chapter 20, when Paul is exhorting the Ephesian elders at the port city of Miletus, as he is getting ready to go to Jerusalem for his first trial after his third missionary journey, he's kind of leaving them with sort of his last charge. And he says, in verse 32, "And now I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and to give you the inheritance among all those who are sanctified." And it's not strictly limited to the Pauline corpus as well. Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, in discussing the sort of priesthood of all believers, he starts in verse 4 of chapter 2 of 1 Peter. He says, "And coming to him as a living stone which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God, you also as living stones are," and here it is again, "being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." And so it seems that this term kind of pervades the New Testament, and it's everywhere. Sort of going back to the first century in your discussion and the sort of timeline that you presented going from the first to the fourth century, there's about a 250 or 300 year development that's going on there. And yet we see some of these elements starting to creep in. What do you see the motivation as being in the early church for these elements coming in, whether that be sacrifice or priesthood? Do you see this as sort of an organic development, or is it being done for doctrinal reasons and it just kind of takes on a life of its own? How do you see these sort of extra biblical concepts or extra New Testament concepts coming into the faith in those early centuries, leading to what we see in the time of Constantine?
Yeah. Now here I'm going to shift into opinion and my guess as to what's going on there. I think everything I've told you so far is fact. I mean, you can find this stuff in your New Testament and your own research. But now let's guess as to why this took place, why they started to view the Lord's Supper as a sacrifice, and why they started to have altars and priests and such. I think Christianity was starkly different from the religions around it, both Judaism and all the pagan religions that were around them. And that was a point of pride for a while. But then, they started to get looked down upon. And I think I sense that second and third century Christians were starting to resent being looked down upon by the community, by society at large. And they begin to acquire for themselves certain status symbols. They have their own sacrifice. They have their own altar. They have their own priests, and then they have their own temples by the 4th century as well. So it garnered for themselves some status in the culture at the time. But another really, probably a bigger factor, I'm guessing here, was the ego of the leaders. What you see also relatively early on are these individuals who are the bishops in the 2nd century. In the 1st century, you don't have one bishop over a whole bunch of churches. Elders, bishops, pastors, shepherds, they're all the same thing in the 1st century. But pretty soon one person starts to percolate to the top of the heap and starts to control and starts to have all this status and power. And I think this whole system feeds that. The priests, and then they start to wear special gowns by the 4th century. And the people look up to the priests in the church. So it definitely helps them. It helps their financial status, and it helps their social status. So that's some of the reasons why I think these things began to creep in to the church at that time.
Yeah, so it seems like even in the 2nd century, church historians will talk about like the apologists. That it seems like in one sense there is an apologetic need for the church to kind of defend itself and provide explanation to the broader culture for what Christianity was all about. And so some of these terms start to be appropriated then by the church, maybe even taking from Old Testament passages, and not necessarily for nefarious reasons or anything like that, but just as the sort of cultural conversation and the conflicts with the wider culture arise, the church appropriates the terminology that it needs in order to kind of justify itself to the wider culture. And then it seems like on the other hand, you also have a growing sense of hierarchy as the church continues to grow in terms of number, in terms of institutional power and status, and especially by the time you get to the 4th century, where you start to have the great councils of the church and the sort of union of church and state in the Constantinian system, that you have kind of a growing sense of, as you mentioned, ego that is starting to develop as well.
In a way, Richard, this is a problem that goes back throughout all time, even through the Jewish world. They give us a king. They want. It's a human instinct. They want to have somebody running the show. They want to have. Also, they wanted to have these temples. A temple. They could be like, those great Egyptians, where there's the temples down there, or the surrounding world having their temples with the pagan religions. So Christians wanted this too. They wanted to have their buildings. They wanted to have their leaders, who were all these prominent individuals. So it's a natural instinct, but it needs to be investigated for how it actually detracts from Christian growth, Christian life, and the Christian community itself.
Excellent. Yeah, and I want to kind of seize on that last point that you mentioned about how it impacts the Christian life and sort of Christian growth. Kind of fast forwarding to our present day, we could talk about the long history of the development of these things, in the early church, in the Middle Ages, even in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, as you mentioned, where maybe certain things were kind of adjusted in a good direction, but the reformers didn't quite capture, um, everything that was kind of going on in this area of ecclesiology. Um, it seems that, at least in modern times, as we fast forward to the modern West, that there's a growing dissatisfaction with this sort of way of doing church. Among young people generally, young men seem to be highlighted in particular in the studies that are out there, with regard to the way in which, especially evangelicals in the modern West, do church. And how would you say that the development of this ecclesiology over time and the way that we've kind of traditionally understood how we do church, so to speak, um, how has that contributed to this growing dissatisfaction, sort of in our modern Western sort of post Enlightenment context?
You mean, in other words, how it's contributed to the downturn in church
And the
attendance across
stagnation,
the
yeah,
board?
yeah, the
Yeah,
stagnation.
stagnation. And this is certain. This is huge, and I'll read articles every day that focus on some churches that are doing some great things and all this exciting stuff. But man, this is just a small, tiny piece of Christianity. As a general rule, the whole of Christian vitality is plummeting. In my own little community, I live in a town of 15,000 people here in northern Illinois, and I've been doing church attendance studies for over 40 years. And I have the cooperation of all the churches in town who give me their numbers, and so I can compare where we were 40 years ago to where we were 35, 30, 25, and even just recently. And it's plummeting. We're down over 60% from where we were a few decades ago. And if the trend continues like this, we're going to reach zero before the year 2050. I don't think we'll get there. I think something will hold it off, but it's still going down. And that's the trend here local, not just in small towns, but in big towns and in all states and even other countries as well. So, but why is this is the question. That's where you're leading. So this is, again, a prognostication on my part. I don't really know exactly what's happening, but my guess is in the 1990s, we saw this explosion of music in churches and the explosion of the worship leader and the praise and worship music and the stage and the fog systems and the lights and the
video screens in the
the
background.
video screens and the rock stars up there with the silver microphone and dressed really cool, and
The V-neck shirt and the skinny jeans.
yeah. You got to have the right outfit to make this work. Nothing wrong inherently with all of that, but I think a lot of people are sitting back and saying, what's going on here? Another thing that's made people sit back and say, what's going on here is COVID. In 2020, when nobody could go to church anymore, and every pastor on the planet had to think, okay, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, we got to get it online. Well, what do you get online? What's the most important thing to get online? And what are we doing anyway? What's the purpose of this thing? And I think there's a lot of people who are also, after they got out of the habit for a few months there in 2020, they decided to say, I really wasn't getting much out of all that. And yeah. So I think the thing contributing to the downfall is maybe a realization that the way we do church is mostly just a ceremonial thing to make us feel good about, if we keep doing the ceremonial thing, we can go to heaven. And if we don't keep doing the ceremonial thing, we're all going to go to hell. Is that true? Wait a minute. And since my videos have hit YouTube, I've been hearing from people all over the world, from every continent. And people are saying, we start to gather with Christians on a local basis, sometimes in a home and just in informal little gatherings. And ever since we left the big church with all the hoopla and the stained glass windows and the pews and the pulpits, they're growing more in 4 weeks than they grew in 20 years in the big church situation. That's what I'm hearing from people. So I think, and I'm not necessarily saying here that if you go to a normal church, it's not worth anything. In a way, you get out of it what you put into it, but you're not really allowed to put anything into it. Your job is to sit there and shut up and be quiet and take notes on the sermon if you can, and then probably forget it. Forget the entire thing by the time you get back to your car in the parking lot. I think that's the normal reality. But the first century gatherings were much, much different, and that's what we probably should be looking at.
Yeah. So you mentioned, I guess, COVID and the big impact that that's had upon people, and that maybe some people are moving into smaller, maybe more intentional style gatherings. However, one of the other trends that we've kind of seen in this, and it's maybe a minority trend but a measurable trend, is this trend towards so-called high churchism, which seems to be in the ascendancy, at least in certain corners of the internet. How much that is on the ground, I'm sure, we've both looked at the work of Dr. Ryan Burge, and he kind of talks about who's converting into which traditions. And I think he even had something just today on X with sort of new data that's kind of dropped on these trends. But there does seem to be, at least, and as I mentioned, young men in particular, this allure of these sort of high church traditions, whether that be something like Eastern Orthodoxy or traditional Latin Mass Catholicism, which is in the news in the past month or so with the whole Society of St. Pius X excommunications, or even in the Protestant context. You see maybe somebody coming out of a non-denominational or a low sort of Baptist or Pentecostal background moving into like a high church Anglican background or a Lutheran background, something that seems to be a little bit more historically grounded. And so you think about things like, liturgy and sacred ceremonies and chant and icons, incense, ancient languages. Sometimes you go to some of these churches and, you hear Latin, or you hear in like a Russian church, like Old Church Slavonic or something like that. And you have the incense and the vestments and, the iconostases that's at the front with all of these old looking pictures. So what answers do you think this sort of movement towards high churchism is providing to meet the sort of dissatisfaction that we've mentioned in regards to people leaving the big church with the computer projector and the fog machines and the lights and the sort of worship music? Why do you think that there's at least a certain sub-segment of evangelicals who are finding their way into these more high church traditions?
Yeah, I think we would be incorrect if we were thinking this is a huge trend, but there is a trend here. There is something going on where people who are accustomed to the low church evangelical type of non-denominational Christianity are being attracted to the high church approach of like an Orthodox situation. And what I have noticed, I'm 73 years old, Richard, and I have kids who are your age, and I have grandkids who are in their teens and such. What I've noticed among my kids and among the next generation is people want authenticity. They want something authentic, something real. I think with the internet, you can now be exposed to so much stuff, and so much stuff that seems phony. They get disgusted with politics because there's a lot of phoniness going on there, and so they look maybe they're looking at the rock star show in a typical worship service of an evangelical megachurch, prancing up and down on the stage, and they're just saying, "Come on, guys, come on," and so then they'll see this elaborate the vestments, the swinging of incense, the tall hats, the flowing robes, the golden crosses, and all the stuff that you'll see in an Orthodox
The domed
situation.
buildings and the
Yeah,
stained glass and all of the sort of historic trappings, the
the icon.
aesthetic
Yeah,
trappings.
yes. And they'll think, authenticity. This is authentic. We're getting back there. But the truth of the matter is, they're getting back to the fourth century. They're not getting back to the first century. You want to get back to the first century, think about gathering with close Christian friends in the living room of somebody's home, sitting in a circle. There's no platform, there's no pulpit, there's no pews, there's no holy stuff hanging around in stained glass, anything. And we're just encouraging one another, going through an orderly process, 1 Corinthians 14, an orderly process of speaking to one another, encouraging one another, comforting one another, sometimes admonishing one another. Even rebukes have to come in there. This is a first century culture. This is authentic. This is first century. Yes, it's kind of messy, but boy, does growth come out through a messy situation. We've taken all the messiness out of it and formalized all this stuff and put professionals in there so that nothing's out of place and everything's just perfect. But I think you grow in the messiness. That was first century authenticity, but we're far from that in our church culture today.
Well, it's interesting. I want to kind of push back just a little bit on this because I think you'll kind of agree with the sentiment where I'm at. Have we really eliminated the messiness though with all of our institutions and formalization, or is it just given us a different kind of messiness?
Yeah, there is some messiness going on there, but it's usually it's beneath the surface. They don't allow that stuff to surface. I remember I was in a church service 20 years ago when the pastor was railing on with his sermon, and somebody stood up and said, "Pastor, wait a minute, Pastor, I don't agree." Whoa! Just everybody just was alarmed that somebody would cause this little bit of messiness, and we just don't like those kinds of interruptions or any discussion like that. Keep yourself quiet until the worship service has ended, and then you may fellowship with one another as you go to your cars. But you're right. There's still some messiness. There's still some problems with the way it is today, but it's a different kind than what they had in the first century.
Yeah. So you kind of mentioned this, and I'll just hesitate on this high church point for just a moment longer before we move on. But it sounds like while this is a measurable trend, it may not be as big as it may seem in certain online spaces like X or YouTube. You had similar such movements, whether it be the Jesus movement in the 1970s or like the Young Restless and Reform movement. Do you see there being a sustainability to this high church model long term, or do you think that there's not really the authenticity in a real sense that would kind of keep that momentum going?
Well, in a way, you can. The high church approach is sustainable. The low church approach is sustainable because what we have built into those systems is funding. We call it tithing. And if you put a little guilt trip on everybody, they can start to put more money in the plate, and it keeps going. You keep paying those guys, and you keep the building keep going, so it keeps going. It is sustainable for a while, but what we're finding now is I think there's more than 1,000 churches closing every year. I think it's 1,500 is the current number I saw. Don't quote me on that, but it's a problem. We're now having this market out there of church buildings that are now available for sale to be converted into whatever somebody wants, whether it's an apartment building or a brewery or whatever you want. So we have a problem. I think what is sustainable are gatherings that build up one another, that build relationships, that respect one another, that hold each other in high esteem. This is first century stuff, by the way. All these principles I'm tossing out are directly stated in the New Testament. That's authentic Christianity. I think that's where we ought to be.
Yeah, yeah. So kind of moving, to the sort of low church or maybe confessional Protestant perspective. There's a number of historic confessions that are out there, whether you want to talk about the Heidelberg Catechism, the Savoy Declaration, the Westminster Confession, the 1689 Second London Confession, and the many other confessions that kind of exist out there. They all have chapters on Christian worship, and many denominations, especially in my context, which is the Reformed context, hold to a regulative principle of worship. So I wanted to kind of read at least one section on this and get your thought on this issue of the regulative principle and whether or not it's applicable or not. So the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, chapter 26, which is on the church, in paragraph 5, states this: "In the execution of this power wherewith he is so entrusted, the Lord Jesus calls out of the world unto himself through the ministry of his word, by his Spirit, those that are given unto him by his Father, that they may walk before him in all the ways of obedience, which he prescribes to them in his word. Thus he commands to walk together in particular societies," and I think that's interesting language there, "or churches, for their mutual edification." And so if we stop right there, it sounds like this is a really, solid statement that's being given. But then the latter part of that paragraph says this: "in the due performance of that public worship, which he requires of them in the world." One of the things that I think is best about the Protestant tradition is that at its best, it's always able to kind of look at itself in the mirror in a critical light and see, what am I holding on to that's tradition versus what am I actually deriving from Scripture? And so does the New Testament command a public worship in addition to mutual edification?
Well, yes. So let's talk about that. That's a good question. It's interesting that the confession that you cited talks about edification. And it reminded me of Thomas Cranmer when he drafted the Book of Common Prayer in the 1500s. I forget the year, 1550s or something. He also caught on to this edification thing. And believe me, anybody reading their New Testament, really trying to get biblical about this idea about assemblies, you have to use the word edification because it's just so adamantly emphasized and commanded in Scripture. So it's got to be there. But what we end up doing, we already all these confessions have been developed in a system that assumes that the gathering is about worship. The RPW, the regulative principle of worship. I understand what they're trying to do there, but they've put the assembly in the wrong category. If you assume that the assembly belongs in the category of worship, of things that we do for God, therefore things must be regulated and things must be done according to the proper way of doing things. The Old Testament temple and the proceedings in the Old Testament temple definitely had to be regulated, and there are over 300 specific commands that applied to the temple proceedings about the kind of temple, it had to be the kind of materials used in the walls, on the floor, and the everything of the way sacrifices had to be done, the kinds of sacrifices that were acceptable, the times that they had to be done, what the guy had to be wearing when he's offering these things, the priest and the high priest, and the day and the time, and it goes on and on and on and on. Everything had to be regulated if you have a worship system. But in the New Testament, all that goes away. I mean, you don't have a worship system. None of the worship language is there applied to what Christians did in their gatherings. They got together. What did they do when they got to? They built up one another. They were told, whatever you do, let all things be done for edification. Let all things be done in love, 1 Corinthians 16:14. These are the things that guide the assembly. Instead of the regulations of a Christian gathering being determined by the right person at the right time, reading the right scripture version, and what's the right regulations in Paul's mind for a Christian assembly is, folks, whatever you do it to build up other people. Do it in love for other people. 1 Corinthians 13. That's also in a big section on the Christian assembly. You do that. Do it with love. Do it to build up one another. You're on the right track. Don't worry about all this other stuff you got to be concerned about. The regulative principles, and I think it's not biblical. We're just approaching it in the wrong category. It's a category error is what it is.
Yeah. I think part of the category error that you seem to be touching on in your work is the sort of imprecise usage of language and of certain terms. I want to read another passage to you from church history as well, because Philip Schaff, the great church historian, also picks up on this idea of edification, but it seems to be mixed in with maybe traditional views that are not necessarily derived from the New Testament. He says in section 52 of volume 1 of his famous History of the Christian Church that starting in paragraph 1, Christian worship, or cultus, it's interesting he uses that Latin term, is the public adoration of God in the name of Christ, the celebration of the communion of believers as a congregation with their heavenly head for the glory of the Lord and for the promotion and enjoyment of the spiritual life. And it's interesting what he says here. While it aims primarily at the devotion and edification of the church itself, it has at the same time a missionary character and attracts the outside world. He says this was the case on the day of Pentecost when Christian worship and its distinctive character first appeared. So it seems like he has this idea, this primary aim of devotion and edification, and then yet you see terms like cultus, you see terms like worship that are coming in, and it seems that there's a kind of an imprecise, usage of language that might be confusing the issue, at least in the historical landscape.
Yes, for my PhD dissertation, one thing you have to do in a dissertation is have a chapter that deals with literature on the topic of worship. And so I did a long, deep investigation into about 25 different scholars over the last century and how they have reflected on this issue of New Testament worship, as we call it that. But I did notice that many of these guys noticed the worship anomaly. Okay, this bizarre, strange fact that in the New Testament, they're not using the language of cultus, like what you refer to. The Jewish temple had a cultus. They had the cult. They had priests. They had all this cultic system of procedures and garb and decoration and all the cult-like things that go along with that. But the New Testament, it's gone. It's absent. The language of cultus is gone. And these scholars recognize that. Even scholars coming at this from a very high church approach recognize, whoa, what's going on in the New Testament? And let me throw in a plug here for one particular scholar that spotted this and wrote about this in 1985. His name is I. Howard Marshall. And his name should resonate, yes, among New Testament folks. Marshall was highly regarded as maybe the dean of evangelical scholarship for 25, 40 years. He was the editor of Evangelical Quarterly for a quarter century. He just died, sadly, about 10 years ago or so. But as a Scotsman, but Dr. I. Howard Marshall wrote an article in 1985. It was titled, "How Far Did the Early Christians Worship God?" And he put worship in italics because he knew something's different here. And if you read the entire article, I'd be glad to share that with anybody. You want to send me an email, I'll send you the article. He notices something's wrong here. And he even says that we've got this wrong. We call it worship, but the New Testament does not. But yet all these scholars who noticed the worship anomaly, they didn't take it to the next level of trying to figure out how we got there. How did we get all this worship language? And what do we do now? Although Marshall touches on it. But anyway, that's a shorter answer to your question.
Yeah. So just a couple questions left for you, Dr. Wadsworth. I want to kind of seize on at least one of these terms that you brought up earlier, and that's the term of latria. Because in preparation for this discussion, actually, this is kind of our second discussion, but I discussed this with some friends of mine who cited a couple of New Testament passages in regard to this term latria and whether or not this sort of mandates a sort of corporate worship, if we want to use that term. You have passages like Romans 12, chapter 1, which talks about, therefore I urge you, brothers, by the mercies of God, present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your logikon latreon, your reasonable or your spiritual service of worship. There's also Hebrews chapter 12 is another passage where this is mentioned, where it says, in verse 28, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude by which we, and they seize on the sort of plural aspect of the pronoun there, by which we may offer to God an acceptable latreon, or I think it's actually in the participial form here, latreomen, latruomen, that's here. I think there might be a small textual variant there. But they'll say, therefore we have to offer this acceptable to service to God with reverence and awe. Are these passages commanding or, showing that the early Christians had a sort of corporate latreon? Or if not, what are these passages, sort of actually pointing to in the Christian walk and in the Christian life?
Great question. So glad you asked that. So what I did for my doctoral dissertation, I knew that something's wrong with our understanding of Greek worship terminology. Latreia, latruo is just one of the 5 different Greek words that are translated as worship in our New Testament. How can 5 different words be translated with the same English word? Is that possible? It turns out none of these 5 words are synonymous. And what I did, by the way, for my dissertation, I looked up every time like the word latreia or latruo is found in the New Testament and in the Old Testament as well. Like latreia, latruo is found over 100 times in the Old Testament, in the Septuagint. And I studied each one of those passages. With proskuneo, which is the primary word, I looked those up all 265 times. It's found in the Septuagint and the New Testament, and studied each time to figure out what's going on with these words, what do they mean, and what is the context. But to cut to the quick on latreia, what latreia means, and this is so helpful. This one was a light bulb moment for me. What it means is to serve deity with sacrifice. It's a catch-all word to refer to the sacrificial process that took place not just in the Jewish temple, but it also was going on in pagan temple as well, because they also offer sacrifices. They do latreia, as did Jews. Jews did it to the God of Abraham, of course, but the pagans are doing it to somebody else. So the interesting thing in the New Testament is you don't see the word used in its noun or verb form to refer to what Christians are doing in their assembly. But you'll see this transformed use of it, like in Romans 12:1, like in Hebrews 12:28, and a few other places, where it's taking this concept of offering sacrifice to deity and using it metaphorically. to refer to what Christians are doing with their lives, like in Romans 12:1, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, for this is your logikane latreon. And it's almost helpful to translate that as latreon and not to translate it as worship, because as soon as you throw the word worship at it, the modern English mind immediately thinks, oh yeah, that's what we do in church. That's what we're doing in church. It's far from the mind of Paul there. It's clearly still has all this concept of offering sacrifices by the context there. Offer, the word offer in Romans 12:1 is the standard word used to offering a sacrifice. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. There he uses the word for sacrifice there. Latreia still has all that the connotation. And then he says, holy and acceptable. And in the Old Testament, sacrifices had to be holy and acceptable. So all that language is there. And he said, what we do now, is by offering our bodies as a living sacrifice, which we do by the transforming of our mind, by living holy and acceptable lives. This is our spiritual latreia. And it has almost nothing to do with what you're doing in church, except what you're doing in church is trying to get better at offering your bodies as a living sacrifice so that you're being more kind, more patient, more sacrificing of your own self for other people, more selfless and less selfish. This is the hallmark of Christian latreia. And Christians understood this, not just in the first century, but you see this same idea popping up in the second and in the third century as well. They got it. They knew that latreia had gone away. Christians don't do that stuff anymore, but what we do is do it metaphorically by offering our lives in holiness, in righteous behavior, doing good things in the community, good works, agatho poieo. This is another theme that's constantly there in so many different passages in the New Testament. This is what we're supposed to be about. This is offering your bodies as a living sacrifice.
Yeah. I did and it's interesting. I want to kind of just unfold a few of my thoughts on this. A few years ago, I did a debate with an Eastern Orthodox lay apologist on the issue of the priesthood and, whether there's a special sacerdotal priesthood over against the priesthood of Christ and the general priesthood of believers. And it seems like, from what I see in these metaphorical usages in the New Testament, one of the reasons there's no special priest in the terms of like a priest class within the New Testament is that every believer is a priest. As we mentioned in 1 Peter chapter 2, we're being built up into this house, this holy priesthood. And that it seems that every Christian is supposed to be offering latreia in his everyday life, that this is an activity that's not bound by time or place or ordination, ritual, or by particular rites or rituals or observances. But it seems to be that this is in the metaphorical usage, something that is ongoing in the life of every Christian, that we're supposed to be engaging in latreia as just part of the normal, ordinary Christian life that every Christian is to be engaging in. And so the whole idea of edification then, in that sense, makes sense, because there's this mutuality that is then going on within the body that's not restricted to one man, that's not restricted to a particular class or clergy. There is no sort of Eucharistic sacrifice that we offer, because every moment of our lives, in a sense, is a latreia to God. And you see this, the writer of Hebrews picks this up in the very next chapter at the very end, where he says, for we do not have here a lasting city, but we are seeking the one to come. Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice. There's that word again of praise to God. It's the metaphorical usage that would be different from the Jewish and the pagan usage of that term. That is the fruit of the lips that confess his name and do not neglect doing good and sharing, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. And so it kind of came full circle for me that, if I had to do that debate over again, I would have actually brought up many of the points that you've brought up in your dissertation and your work, in that no, there can't be a special priesthood, because this is something that every Christian is to be doing in his life. That it's not just one priesthood holder at the front of the church, doing the Eucharistic sacrifice. That latreia is something that every Christian is to engage in, and hence it makes sense that we're all called priests under that
Yep.
the new covenant.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's so interesting to read second century Christian literature and then third century on this point. They got it. They understood this, that Christians have no temples. And it's the destruction of the temple that cemented this whole idea. And Christians knew this. The temple goes away, the priests go away, the altars go away, the sacrifices go away, all because of Jesus. When I think modern Christians may not even be aware that the temple was utterly destroyed in AD 70. They may not be aware that Jesus spent significant time in the Gospels predicting that not one stone will be left upon another. Everybody's heard that when Jesus died, the veil of the temple was torn in two. Early Christians got it. They said, wow, that whole thing blown away. Blown away. And when Paul's statement in Acts chapter 17, he's there in Athens on Mars Hill, and he says to them, the God who made the heavens and the earth does not dwell in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. Christianity is a temple-free religion. It is not building-based at all. It's all gone. It doesn't need all the accoutrements that go along with that, such as the priests and the altars and the sacrifices and the stained glass and the pews and the pulpits. Don't need all that. It's all now. This is the temple. Our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. God, instead of living in some building someplace, is now living in us. That changes everything. We now offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. Why? Because God is now in you. Christ in you, the hope of glory. Thus, we ought to be getting better with our lives. God changed his residence and put himself in us for a reason, so that we might not be the same scoundrels we were last year or last week or last decade. So we're getting better. We're improving through the Holy Spirit, through this one anothering process that takes place in the assembly of edifying, strengthening, and encouraging one another. We get better. And I think people who've looked at my worship stuff and been appalled at it, they're not seeing the upside to this. I mean, imagine going to a gathering where you're getting better every week, or actually working on one another. You're building relationships in the body. This is all good. It is all good. It's nothing bad about this, but it does take a significant shift in your understanding of what in the world we're doing when we get together.
Yeah. Well, I kind of want to finish off, in light of what you just mentioned about how, people are being built up and getting better in this edification model of the church. Sort of going back to, Dr. Ryan Burge's work on the sort of decline in, sort of numbers and on the whole in the population as it relates to people who are identifying as Christians. I see this particularly in my profession as a physician. In addition to the loss of sort of individual people, there also seems to be an institutional loss that has been occurring for quite some time. And it seems that a lot of Christian denominations, sort of organizations, are kind of retreating into these sort of ecclesial-centric models of doing things. So, for instance, the number of Christian universities, law schools, civic organizations, charities, also seem to be kind of either closing up shop or they're, sort of secularizing. I think I mentioned in some of our correspondence, you have a university like Wake Forest University in North Carolina, which for a long time was a identifiably Baptist university, and today it is a purely non-sectarian, secular university with no sort of religious affiliation at all. And so this seems to kind of run counter to what we see in Christianity at its best, where Christians were founding things like hospitals and schools, and they were into the idea of institution building and cultural, sort of production. Think about the high arts that existed in like the Middle Ages, and it seems that in a lot of ways, Christians are kind of being almost marginalized in the society from the sort of civic, cultural, productive institutions. And so the question I have, and it's maybe too big for this podcast, probably is too big for this particular interview, but it's maybe something to throw out to the audience, is under this edification model of ecclesiology, if we are no longer going to have, as the numbers show, these massive endowments that have been given through tithing, and all of these institutions are sort of going away, what is a way that we as Christians, under this model of edification, as we gather and the way that we organize ourselves, how can we engage in sort of cultural production as well as in institution building, not in the sense of buildings or denominations, but producing Christian doctors and Christian nurses and lawyers and accountants and scientists and mathematicians and all the sort of productive cultural generation that Christians have engaged in the past, that as our numbers have declined in the West, that also seems to be going away as well.
Yeah, really, that's a great question. Nobody's ever posed that to me before, but it's a great one for discussion. I'm just talking off the top of my head here on this. You might think that with the decline of the Christian institution, part of the reason that they're not involved in creating any like educational institutions or medical institutions anymore.
Movies,
they just
great works of art, literature, all of these things. Yeah.
Well, it could be, that maybe they just don't have institutionally, they don't have the funding to be able to do anything anymore. But I think there's something else going on here. Really, what these institutions, the medical or the educational or whatever, what they really need is just a human being somewhere who's got funding, and yet who also is compassionate, also is generous, who has all these Christian virtues that the New Testament constantly hammers away at, being kind and taking care of the poor and the widows and the orphans, and this kind of emphasis that is there. If we are truly in our gatherings building up one another, and we're working toward maturity in Christ on a regular basis, and truly being edified and strengthened and encouraged every single week, I think within a relatively short amount of years, you will be having people who are actually getting to be mature and caring and giving and generous and concerned about all of those things. But I think in our modern institutional churches, we're more concerned about giving money to keep the church going, because it's going to die if we don't pump more money into it. But I remember I've done a lot of work in local history here. I'm actually a historian for the local paper and write stuff about local history. And so I've explored, the beginnings of Christianity in this area. Ultimately, it takes just one Christian, one person who is filled with the Spirit of God, filled with a Christian compassion for the community around them, and a desire to spread Christianity, spread the gospel to other people, that things start to happen. You don't need the institution to make it go. You need a person who's got the funding. That's where it starts. And I think if you start to get a whole lot of those people, wow, you could, whether it's to build a new medical school, a new hospital, a new college, like Harvard was originally a Christian thing, and Princeton, of course, all this stuff, all these old schools in America were founded by ministers and as a Christian effort. But all that is indeed gone away. But that's just some thoughts off the top of my head there, Richard. You probably have some thoughts of your own on this.
Yeah. One thought that I had that, had kind of come to mind as I was thinking about this question is, I think about, a production company like the Kendrick Brothers back in Georgia, where I'm from. I think they did things like Fireproof and Facing the Giants and, some of these other, sort of Kirk Cameron style, Christian movies that have come out. And it seems that
movies,
while the production value is not bad, they actually do a fairly decent job in terms of production value, that oftentimes these movies end up turning into being almost sermons of a sort. It's like there's an exportation of, ideas that are almost ecclesial centric. Like you have to make your movie a sermon. Everything has to kind of be an altar call, as opposed to just building people up and saying, hey, you're good at making films. You should go out and make good films. And should there be Christian themes and that kind of stuff? Sure, but that should be something that is more natural and more organic. You're not trying to force these almost traditional, ecclesial centric productions like a sermon or an altar call into a movie or into a book or a work of art. That it should be something that is grounded in a sort of deep Christian, worldview and commitment and, life. But it doesn't have to be this almost artificial production that in a way is almost parallel to the sort of artificial nature of much of the things that we may do on Sunday mornings. And so I think, part of that idea of mutual edification is that you're building people up. And it's like most of the young people in your church are not going to become pastors. They're not going to become ministers. Maybe a few of the young men may become a deacon or something like that. But most people are going to be engaged in some other, trade or profession in their life. And what they really need from the church is obviously the eternal principles and, the gospel that is being given to them. But to recognize that, yes, you have this deep Christian conviction and commitment, but you should go and be a good doctor, a good accountant, and, a good attorney, a good, film producer or whatever it is. And you should do those things to the glory of the Lord, but not in this artificial, contrived way that as you're being built up, that these things are going to naturally leak out. Because, you look at somebody like J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis and these great works of literature. They weren't trying to sermonize in what they were doing, that they were just as good Christian men and good Christian, authors, those principles kind of leaked through, but they were doing good stories because they wanted to do a good story. And I think in some ways, maybe that's a little bit of how we can, kind of get back to that is, we should actually be encouraging our young people. You walk in your Christian faith as you walk in the vocation, in the discipline that, God has gifted you in. And that church on Sunday morning should be encouraging people, in their lives to walk well as they're doing these other things.
Yeah, I'm with you on this. I have two different thoughts going in my head. My original series of 7 videos on this topic, video number 4 was entitled Why They Didn't Preach Sermons in the Early Church. And why would I say such a thing like that? Well, the word preach in the New Testament is not used to refer to what the kind of speech that took place in Christian assemblies. Preaching, proclamation, is what happened outside the assembly, sometimes in public settings, or maybe in a synagogue where you're going to go preach at Jews to get them to become Christians. Preaching happens to non-Christians. But inside, you have exhortation, you have encouragement, those kinds of things are happening. And you don't have sermons either in the first century church. The word sermon is not found in the Bible. The amazing thing is, the word sermon is not even found in the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, that's a topic, a title that we threw at that thing. So we're also screwed up, I think, on what we expect to be happening in our gatherings. We think we ought to be, some good preaching ought to be taking place, and there ought to be a good sermon this week. But, the first century, they're meeting in homes, and they're encouraging one another. Everybody's got an opportunity to speak. And here's my second thought that I had to follow up on what you said. You mentioned young people so frequently. We're now at the end of senior camp week in my local area, and I've spoken in camp many times to the senior kids. These are high school kids, often senior high. They get so fired up in a camp setting where they're living with one another for a full week. They're having close Bible studies with small groups and talking and engaging one another and loving one another. The relationships that are built in this is just phenomenal. And the kids come out of there on fire, wanting to use their skills, their gifts, whatever they've got. But inevitably, they go back to their local congregation where somebody else has the job of preaching a sermon for 40 minutes, and they've got nothing to offer. Nobody's listening to them. They don't even have an opportunity anywhere to plug in. I have spoken at camp about kids becoming excellent movie makers, become excellent writers, excellent songwriters. Whatever your skill is, apply this as a Christian. Or to use Paul's language, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. This is your reasonable latreia. Do that. But the modern church culture, I think, stifles that so that these kids who are on fire, like tomorrow on Sunday, getting back to their local church, but yet they'll have cold water thrown all over them, and it will die on the vine. And I think within a couple of years, their excitement, their on-fireness will have been doused, and it'll stop. That's a real shame. What camps are doing are great, but the reality of our worship services and our preaching services and these sermons is different than what that was going on in the first century, and I just don't think it's that productive.
Yeah.
And by the way, I was a full-time pastor dude promoting all that stuff in my life for 10 years, but no longer. And I look back now on that, realizing what I should have been doing.
Yeah. Well, the church truly is the ground and pillar and support of the truth, as the apostle says in his letter to Timothy, then I think that we should constantly be examining ourselves in light of those very scriptures to see if we're going about doing church the way that the New Testament and the inspired word is telling us to do things. And so I think there is a way forward, and I do see encouraging signs even amidst what seems like sort of a relative or maybe an absolute decline in numbers in the culture. That I still believe that God is building His church in every age, and that we should take heart, and we should look back at what the scriptures are actually teaching on these issues, and we should mold ourselves in light of what the written word says.
Exactly. I'm with you, Richard. And I really appreciate you taking the mindset of a physician and just looking at this stuff to see what makes sense. And are we accurately using these scriptures? Your approach is so valuable and needed. So I want to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Dr. Wadsworth. And as we're getting out of here, I know that you have a book that's currently being written? And do you want to point people to any of your other resources and how they can get in touch with you? And I'll be sure to leave some things in the show notes as well.
Yes, I'm currently working on a book that's based on all the findings of my dissertation. I've tried to dumb down the dissertation into making more on a popular level where people will understand what we're saying. I'm in the middle of that book now. I've got a contract to get it finished by November of this year. I'm a little behind schedule right now, so I'm a little concerned about that. But
sorry for putting you further behind schedule.
well, it's true you did, but I love these discussions. I really can't keep myself away from it. So that's there. But if you want to see what I'm saying, go to my YouTube channel. Go to youtube.com/@Tom Wadsworth, and you'll see all my videos. There's something like 60 of them there now. Or go to my website, www.tomwadsworth.com. And there I have my full dissertation is available for free. Download the PDF of that 300-page monster with all 900 footnotes, and you can begin to pour through exactly what I've been saying, plus several other articles I've written. There's an FAQ section where people have been firing questions at me, and I've been answering those. I think you'll find there's videos there and a bunch of other things that should be helpful. So thanks for asking about that. Hopefully that'll hold people off until I finally get this book done, which probably still won't be in print until early next year.
Yeah,
2027.
Well, I'll link to these resources in the show notes for everybody. And I certainly have found your dissertation to be quite helpful. I haven't gotten through all 300 pages, but I've gotten a couple, at least 200 pages in. So I need to try to find time to finish it off myself. But certainly looking forward to your book next year when it comes out. And I would point out to everybody in the audience, go to Dr. Wadsworth's website, check out all the resources that are there. And Dr. Wadsworth, once again, thank you for taking time today to have this discussion. And I hope that everyone in the audience finds it quite edifying to their own walk. So
Thank you, Richard.
Yep. Thanks so much, Dr. Wadsworth. We'll take care, everybody, and we'll talk to y'all later.